Hello, everybody. I'm back. I'm here with Dr. Joy and Florian. Dr. Joy, you had some things that you wanted to say first before we get started.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I would be remiss not to call into the room the brilliant work of Dr. Latanya Sweeney, who you saw speaking just now. She's a historic figure. She was the first woman to get her PhD in computer science from MIT, but not the last. I followed in her footsteps, and I almost didn't because I was going to drop out. I had 3 degrees. I thought I was doing all right, right? But she reminded me what time it is, and so I'm forever grateful for that and her pioneering work on algorithmic bias, which my work builds on, alongside the work of people like Dr. Safiya Noble, author of Algorithms of Oppression, people like Dr. Ruha Benjamin, Race After Technology, and so many more as well. And I have to call in my sister, Dr. Timnit Gebru, who is the founder of the Distributed AI Research Network, and together we did some of the most seminal research in the field of algorithmic bias and algorithmic auditing. I could go on, but I hear there's a panel.
So thank you so much for that, Dr. Joy. Florian, this question is actually for both of you, but I wanted to ask a little bit about the challenges that generative AI poses to creative professions. I mean, sometimes you see people say things like, "Oh, well, you don't need to be an artist now. You can just use an AI." You have some, I think, I wouldn't call them micro scandals because I think they are pretty significant, but like within certain artistic communities, the unacknowledged use of AI in certain corners has become very controversial within those communities. Can you talk a little bit about, either of you, both of you, about the challenges that artists face with this new technology?
I have strong feelings about this. There are people who will lose their jobs. Those jobs are things that are easily reproducible. And from a fine arts perspective, maybe not that interesting. I think that overwhelmingly what's also true is I am super bored by almost everything I've seen that people are calling art in the generative AI space. It lacks soul, it lacks rigor, it doesn't move me. And I think it's because people aren't the right people, either haven't gotten their hands on it yet, or people aren't thinking critically enough about what is it that this tool can do for us that prior mediums cannot, right? We face this with every invention of every new technology that we as artists use. And so I'm really curious in this space about what can only it do? What are the places a camera can't go? How would it look to use some of these generative AI tools informed by a real photographic or image making practice, learning off of real work that is produced by an artist, right? Leveraged by the artist themselves to produce something that they cannot make with a camera? That's interesting. I don't know if it's good or bad or wrong or right, but I don't know that we've explored the potential of it in this realm to its fullest extent yet. And I think that urgently we need to become fluent, because what I know from my last job is it's not stopping and we will be left behind.
When I think of generative AI, I really view it as regurgitative AI. And there's been so much talk today about archives. And when I think of archives in the sense of AI systems, I think about data sets and who's included in the data set, who's not included in the data set as well. When it comes to artist agency at the Algorithmic Justice League, we did a campaign called the 4 Cs campaign. So we are thinking, first of all, where's the consent? So much of what people look at with AI, generative AI systems that inspire awe, is because it has been taken from what inspired awe created by humans in the first place. So ask me before you use my images, right? Then there's, of course, the compensation piece. Who's making money? And I was so glad to see the fellowships that you shared earlier with some of the projects you were doing. And then there's another piece of credit as well. And I think where you're getting at is the fourth C when we're thinking about creative rights here, which is control and agency. Maybe I do want to experiment with these tools. And what I find often with the Algorithmic Justice League, when we're talking to artists, composers, filmmakers, people are dabbling, but they're dabbling in the dark because there's a stigma around using these tools, and understandably so, right? If they're made on contested data at best, stolen data, it makes sense. And so are there spaces where we can actually create ethical AI pipelines so that you feel confident, right, when you are starting to experiment, and also you know a little bit more about where the data is coming from and where the data is going. And so I do think those options can be available, but we're generally not going to have it coming from the big tech players as they're situated right now. So generative AI is looking a little bit regurgitative, and we want to have that flavor that human experience imbues into art and creative practice.
Dr. Joy, obviously, you were talking in that in the clip that was shown earlier about algorithmic bias and the harms that can be caused by AI. But that was, a few years ago, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about where we are now as far as these things are concerned, because I think people are justifiably worried. No,
that's a great question. When I hear that video played back 6 years ago, same pants though, they still fit, right? The jacket was a different situation. It felt like it could have happened yesterday. And that's what I've seen with this conversation on artificial intelligence. When I was talking about this work in 2016, that's when the TED Talk came out, most people were asking me, what's AI? Right? So there was a lot that needed to happen to even get to a public conversation about the possibilities and the limitations of AI systems. So since that chart you saw of AI harms, what we've seen is an accelerated adoption of AI, not just in the areas we're seeing in the workplace, in the classroom, and so forth, but also in military. And that has been extremely concerning to me. So the work of the Project Douglas work, right? I look at that, and in that case, to be visible on your own terms is a celebration. There are other spaces where being visible makes you a target. And how do we decide how those technologies will be used? Companies like Google and Amazon are part of Project Nimbus, which provides cloud services, to military operations. So I am a poet, the poet of code, and I have a poem, if you'll permit me, that's about this particular danger of AI systems, and it's called Precisely Who Will Die. Starlight. Precisely who will die? Some say AI is an existential risk. We see AI as an exterminating reality, accelerating annihilation, augmenting destruction. I heard of a new gospel, delivering death with the promise of precision, the code name for an old aim to target your enemy, the other, reduced to rubble. Face erased, name displaced, as the drones carry on in a formation that spells last shadow. AI wars first fought at the doors of our neighbors. Next, the bombs drop on your private chambers. Cease to believe fire on fire will deliver peace. Precisely who will die, zeroed out by ones and guns.
Well, I think that's actually a great way to segue into the next question, which is about the use of AI facial recognition technology, which I think has been spreading. We talked a little bit about backstage about Amazon, but I think there's also TSA, of course, TSA for the past year, if you've gone through an airport and you have like Clear or something like that, they do the facial recognition thing. And I'm very interested, particularly after, some of the concerns expressed in the poem, how you see the technology being used in this way.
Yeah. How many people have been to the airport lately? Show of hands. All right. How many people were told to step up to the camera and have their face scanned? How many people knew that was optional? Okay. So we just released a paper called Comply to Fly, looking at TSA's experiment with facial recognition technologies, and we've been collecting travelers' experiences for over 2 years. We always get receipts. We're the Algorithmic Justice League. So what did the record show? Well, when it came to people who knew if they could opt out or not, 99% of people were not verbally told they could opt out. Instead, you're told by somebody in uniform, maybe on a power trip, maybe not, right? Telling you to step up to the camera. And you have social pressure. There are people behind you in line. There's time pressure. I don't know what time you get to the airport, but there's always time pressure for me, right? And there's the economic pressure as well. You've already put money here. And so in that kind of circumstance, you really can't have informed consent. So when TSA claims that this is an optional pilot, in practice, that's not what people were reporting that their lived experience was. Furthermore, when people attempted to opt out, who has tried to opt out? Yeah, okay. We have an opt-out club, so we'll send you your patches. There, you'll become opt-out members, shop.ajl.org. We will be styled in the resistance. And so—
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Of those of you who decided to opt out, were you allowed to opt out? Sorry, I was just saying I insisted, but there was pushback.
Yeah, and that very much aligns with what we were seeing with the hundreds of reports that were submitted. So about 67% of people who tried to opt out reported receiving negative treatment, and some of it was pushing back, like, why are you doing this? Undermining their opt-out, their cameras everywhere anyways, to kind of say it doesn't matter. In some instances, people were berated, literally, you must be stupid. Other instances, you had children being scanned without their parents' consent, and also bringing in a disability angle and differently abled individuals. I remember one story with a man with autism and his son with autism as well, and they didn't even take the time to understand the situation, just scanning. You have parents wrangling kids, they don't see any of the signage as well. So overall, long story short, right, what was supposed to be an optional pilot is now on track to be rolled out to 430 airports. And so that's why we started the Freedom Flyers campaign, to actually let people know of their right to opt out. And going back to what you mentioned with Amazon, why this is linked is what we're seeing with the ubiquitous spread of cameras and increased facial recognition technologies is the infrastructure for surveillance, right? So you're laying down surveillance infrastructure, and you could have an authoritarian government come into play. So now you have a situation where Amazon is providing Ring. So Ring, you have the doorbell with the camera. Now they say an optional introduction we have is this familiar face feature, so that people you know, right, you can be alerted. But to scan people you know, you also have to scan people you don't know as well. So what's happening in the airports doesn't just stop at the airports. So what you can now do with Amazon is actually tap into the databases that are being used by TSA and others. So we're only one line of code away from surveillance. So I see an increased adoption of facial recognition in some spaces, but also we've seen that resistance works. With the Amazon Ring situation, it wasn't allowed in Texas, it wasn't allowed in Illinois, and the reason being is they actually have privacy protections when it comes to biometric rights. So BIPA, Biometric Information Privacy Act of Illinois, that's why it couldn't be released there. So even though we still don't have federal protections when it comes to abuse of facial recognition technologies, there's so much more that can be done at the local level, state level. So we've done projects like Drag versus AI, where we work with libraries, we can work with schools, where you say, okay, within these settings, these are the parameters we want to play with or not. And oftentimes we're saying we don't want the face to be the final frontier of privacy.
Can I also want to uplift one of the subtle points in here, which is literacy. We've talked so much about the connection between reading and freedom over the last 2 days. This is a new kind of reading that we have to be fluent in. I think it's so important that more of us understand the difference between recognition and detection, right? How do these tools work? A familiar faces or a frequent faces feature. How do I translate the marketing jargon that's in this product to understand what it's actually taking from me, right? This is where if we don't know how to read it, we won't know how to stop it. And I think it has to be one of our technologies in this community and that we take back to our communities.
Great.
Can you
play that for us now?
Oh yeah, sure. That example in particular, right? Detection understands that something is a face, but it doesn't link that face to you, right? So it recognizes this box is a face, this box is a face. Recognition goes the extra step and attaches that to a specific face that says, I associate this with you and not someone else.
Yeah. Another way I think about it is asking two questions. Is there a face? That's face detection. So like on the cover of Unmasking AI, which started the Algorithmic Justice League, this is a face detection failure. I'm putting on a literal white mask to have my human face detected, right? And then when you talk about facial recognition in a technical sense, it comes in two flavors. So there's one-to-one matching, which is what you'll see like on an iPhone, right? And then there's one-to-many matching. This is Mission Impossible. You have your person of interest. You have the surveillance cameras. The reason I make this distinction is sometimes what companies will say is, oh, it's like the face recognition you use on your phone. One-to-one, limited to your face and the face you were expecting, or your little sister who looks like you, or whoever else might be able to open your phone, right? What we're seeing happening in places like Amazon Ring, or what we're seeing happening with TSA, is you can search a terrorist watch list, right? Now, ICE can now start using these systems, and accuracy doesn't matter. We have so many examples of people being falsely arrested by facial recognition. People like Robert Williams, falsely arrested in front of his 2 daughters and his wife. Portia Woodruff, 8 months pregnant, when she was misidentified by the same police department that misidentified Robert Williams 2 years earlier. And she was accused of carjacking. Now, I don't know anyone doing carjacking 8 months pregnant, like just context clues, right? But when you have these technical tools making claims, then people can just say, oh, well, the AI told me.
Right, there's a false sense of certainty that comes with the tool that isn't actually present within the tool.
Yes, Meredith Prasad terms this techno-chauvinism, and she writes about this in Artificial Unintelligence for sure.
Can you say a little bit more about techno-chauvinism?
It's very much that over-indexing credibility to machines. So even if you have the context clues that this pregnant woman, 8 months pregnant, probably shouldn't be carjacking, right? We're going to say we'll cede our critical thinking to a machine.
In keeping with that theme, I mean, y'all were talking earlier about, I mean, Florian, you said, you haven't seen any generative AI art that is, in any way comparable to actual human-produced art, and you mentioned it, that's in part because it's just regurgitating what it's been trained on. But I'm wondering if there have been any actual creative uses of AI that in this sort of generative AI space that are consistent with artistic rigor that you can think of, or that So I'll give a journalistic example. I use an AI transcription service So, one of the most boring parts of journalism, or frustrating, because, personally I hate hearing my own voice, is having to listen to me interview somebody and type it up. And that's a job that used to take hours, and it now takes minutes because of an AI. But the AI isn't doing the writing for me. It's not doing the reporting for me. It's not asking the source the questions. And I'm wondering if there's something like that in, creative spaces where the AI helps, but it is not taking the place of human creativity in that sort of vulgar way that you were discussing earlier.
I will say sometimes the AI is writing for you, even if you don't necessarily know it. So when you're using, we've seen evidence of this with doctors using transcription services, right, while they're speaking to a patient. And they will have the patient saying things that the patient actually didn't say, that oftentimes have
Yes, you have to go back and correct.
And sexism. Yeah. But it's hard to correct, because what will happen is, for privacy reasons, they will lose the original audio.
Yeah.
So then the only thing that's remaining are the hallucinations that then become your medical record. Yeah.
That's terrifying.
Yes. But back to the question.
I want to challenge what I said earlier and actually recognize, in the spirit of community building, Aperture's issue on AI in photography, I think, is one of the examples I've seen that really allows you to immerse in projects that take an interesting perspective on this. The project that sticks out in my mind, again, going back to what can only this tool do, I'm forgetting the name of it, but there's an artist who took, she artificially generated videos of apologies from politicians and public figures from whom we'll never hear them. And it is so, it's leveraging deepfake technology. One of them was Alex Jones, another was Brett Kavanaugh. And the point is not to convince us that we actually saw a thing that didn't happen, right? I think the interrogation of what's real and what's fake is part of the practice. But the experience of sitting and watching Brett Kavanaugh give an apology speech, as you're watching it, you realize that the feeling of how surreal that is the point, right? That it's almost impossible to imagine, even as it's being shown to you. And I think that when we're given examples like this, they can expand our imagination, right? That has a very, very dark, double-sided edge to it as a technology overall, which you've done tons of research on, and I'm not endorsing deepfake technology as a whole, but I do think that as artists, with this technology, there are lots of questions that we can ask about what this tool does, purely as a tool, right? In the same way that the camera can be a tool that might offer us an imagination about what we can't see in front of us.
Yeah, I think the seduction of imagination from deepfakes has to be measured with how we're seeing deepfake technology used. 98% of non-consensual deepfake explicit imagery of porn is of women and young girls. And so whether we're in the US, in Europe, all around the world, we're seeing so many negative uses of deepfake technologies, which makes me question, even with your performance yesterday, and the question of reparations. Now that you have tools like Sora, generative AI, image systems or video systems, what you were mentioning with the fake apologies that never happen, what I'm concerned about with deepfake technologies is the blurring. Wait, what actually was said, what wasn't said? And so then when it comes to even the historic record, maybe we'll say the evidence you presented was fabricated, or you create something else. So one of the women I called into the room earlier, Dr. Timnit Gebru with the Distributed AI Research Network, she just sent me an example where there was a grainy video. It wasn't even the hyper-realistic deepfake. Sometimes we call them cheap fakes, right? Of somebody supposedly shoplifting.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. I know exactly what you're talking about.
Right?
And it's like, well, can you generate, maybe this pregnant woman didn't carjack anybody, but actually, there's video. So as improbable as you think it is.
Right. or invalidating the evidence you would present, right, for a family member that actually exists. And so that brings up the importance of provenance with all of these systems. And I think backstage we were talking about how that's one, I don't believe the tech companies will save us, right? But I do think that is one area where we can actually push for robust standards, where this is just the way it's done, where we have data provenance to understand where a specific image was created or video was generated by an AI system.
Which I think has another layer of consequence for a room full of artists. I really hoped that this blockchain innovation was going to give us the system whereby we could stop blindly extracting resources from artists whose work are selling a 5th, 8th, 12th time in the secondary market, and they see none of that value. You know, imagine a Kerry James Marshall whose work sold way back when, who's now watching these things go to market for prices that he's never seen in his lifetime for his work, right? Obviously, he's still with us, and there are so many examples of this, but provenance, right? Being able to trace where something came from, where it has been, who has purchased something, how they made something, is potentially one of the opportunities of this technology that keeps resources in the hands of the creators. I'm not optimistic about this stuff. I want to be clear. Like, I don't think the big tech companies are going to save us. And I think overwhelmingly, unfortunately, what we're seeing is market dynamics drive this stuff to the cheapest and fastest way to make money, which is usually not in the interest of public health and safety. But if I look at it from the vantage point of this room of careful hands and minds who have an opportunity to steer and shepherd some of these tools, I am curious about what some of that opportunity presents for us as a community.
Dr. Joy, you have a documentary that's touring right now called Coded Bias, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Coded Bias, like the Algorithmic Justice League, was made possible in part by Ford Foundation, Just Film Fund. So we actually screened in Sundance in 2020. That's when I had a chance to meet Kimberly Crenshaw, who came on as an inaugural board member for us as well. And I think what Coded Bias did was humanize AI harms. And that's part of what the work of the Algorithmic Justice League and our evocative audits do, like AI Anti-Woman. In that poem, when I say, can machines ever see my queens as I view them? Can machines ever see our grandmothers as we knew them? When I call to Ida B. Wells, data science pioneer, hanging facts, stacking stats on the lynching of humanity, teaching truths hidden in data, each entry and omission, a person worthy of respect. This is what we're doing with the film, showing that we are all worthy of respect. And so we started it in Paris this year at the AI Action Summit. Then we took it to RightsCon in Taiwan. And then the first global AI summit on Africa happened in Kigali, so we took it there. Then the people at home were like, what about us? So we sent it to Oxford, Mississippi, and I actually showed it in my first public library. And so I remember being on the stage that I used to watch puppet shows and magic shows with my brother, and he was in the front row with my niece, you know, and it was a full circle moment. I feel like we grew up on the picture-perfect neighborhood in Oxford, Mississippi, professor kids, kids of professors, one of the Mississippi state representatives and all of that. So we looked like a slice of America that didn't quite exist, but we were trying to make it exist in that moment. And then we were also talking to kindergartners and preschoolers who were learning about AI and learning about tech as well. And then from there, we took it to Oxford University, doing the tour as part of an accelerator fellowship. I did the Rhodes Scholarship there. And so to screen Coded Bias in Rhodes House in a very specific hall that is known for so many racial undertones also felt like a reclamation of space. And now we are, after I get on this, I head on a train and a plane headed to Nairobi. So the tour is ongoing and the conversation continues to resonate.
That's great. One thing I was wondering, you mentioned you mentioned the state laws in Illinois and Texas that help prevent sort of invasive uses of AI facial recognition technology. But I'm wondering, are there any examples of that in the artistic space, sort of places where state or federal regulation have been constructive? Or, are there ways of doing that either of you think would, is there a possibility of making rules that are fair and also respectful of the people whose work is being drawn from?
Well, being that I grew up in the South, so after Oxford, Mississippi, we went to Memphis, Tennessee. So when it comes to AI legislation, because we have Nashville, you actually saw legislation around preserving art, right? Because there's an economic imperative there when it came to the use of artists' work without consent. You've seen this with Universal and others as you see AI-generated music. But the space is so contested. Some people might have seen Tilly Norwood, which is this AI, I'm calling it imposter actress. So now you have an AI system that is up for representation that real people don't even get. In my different hats I wear, sometimes I'm a model. And so there was one campaign that I did where back in 2021, let's be inclusive, let's bring in dark-skinned models. That was happening. And then they said, you know what? We can simulate that with AI models. So we can show that we have a diverse group of people without actually having any real economic circulation happening. And we're seeing this with these AI creators in blackface, right? Getting real money, to represent brands as well.
I'll draw from my own experience here. One of the things that we fought tooth and nail on in the real tone work was the use of real people and paying real models. Because in a lot of these photographic testing labs, especially in the earliest stages of development, there are companies that sell really lifelike humanoid models with real hair that are meant to approximate, a certain set of facial characteristics, right? The kinds of testing that you go through to build a smartphone camera include, every detail from is someone wearing a hijab to does someone have freckles to does someone have scarring, right? What's somebody's level of vision? All of these details that you have to be able to test to then approximate what's going to happen when I take this thing out into the wild, so to speak, and am making hundreds of thousands of images that were never tested, right? It's the nature of using a camera. And it was unbelievable to me how hard a battle that was. We won it, importantly, but the lowest common denominator will always be the cheapest, fastest way. And I think, unfortunately, to your question about legislation in this space as it relates to artists, the governments are looking to a lot of the companies right now to define what the practices should be in their tools because they don't even really understand how this stuff works. So going back to the point of provenance, I was in a conference in Milan a couple of years ago where Adobe was presenting. And I was like, the government is coming to Adobe to ask questions about how to do this and not the other way around, right? If you're an artist who's coming into a Photoshop today who doesn't have this context and who says, oh, let me fill something, and who doesn't understand how many other people's work that might be pulling from unpaid, you're contributing to that system without even knowing it, right? And so I'm a big fan. I keep going back to Theaster because I think this idea of the attic and the basement, what are those spaces for us? We can build some of these things that are contained. Models can be made for contained data sets that don't need to feed back into, a chat GPT or whatever. And there are opportunities for us to build those things for each other, to mine archives differently, right? To understand the connective tissue between different kinds of work that don't depend on some of these predatory practices.
If you don't mind, I'm just gonna ask about a particular fear of mine, which since this started, I've had this sort of paranoia that we're sort of entering a world in which there's going to be a significant class divide in the kind of art that you're allowed to consume. So, if you are rich, you pay for like human-made movie or music, but if you're not, you get something generated by a machine. And I'm just wondering, am I just being paranoid? Is that a crazy thing to think about? Or is that something, because you talked about companies going toward the lowest common denominator. is the lowest common denominator ultimately people using AI to like generate something that sounds familiar that they've already heard a million times before, and then like if you want to pay for someone to make real music from the heart or something like that, that becomes something that's only available to people with lots of money.
Am I concerned? Yes. Do I think that we have more control over that than we think? A lot of the industry's language is about projection. This whole notion that AI is inevitable is marketing. It's not fact. There are people who have a vested interest in making sure that we think that that is true, and they will say it over and over again until it is. And so I think maintaining that critical lens a little bit about like what's definitely going to happen versus what we can change is important. I also think the quality of some of this work, some things have always been true. Mm-hmm. I know people in college who, because we didn't have money back then, would take pictures of a picture they liked, go to the lab, print it bigger, and that was your art in college, right? They all swore that when they graduated and went on to jobs, we'd get rid of that stuff. But you could go do the same thing today where you take a scan of something and use a generative fill to try and upscale something so that you have a larger print of a crappy file that you got off the internet. But none of that to me captures why this matters to us as people in a society. So from that vantage point, I think the essence of the work, I'm not worried, but I do think we have to take preventative measures.
Yeah, and I know we're on time, so maybe to wrap it up a little bit, I think when I look at the future of art and its preservation, I think of libraries, I think of foundations and so forth, and I have to also think of Darren Walker, because I look at something like AI Ain't I a Woman, which is an AI audit, but it's also spoken word poem, right? And Ford Foundation invested in the creation of that before even investing in the Algorithmic Justice League and all the research to come. And so I'd like to end with this poem in tribute to Ford Foundation and Darren Walker called He Walked With Us. His voice, deeply melodic, joyful gravitas, meeting our ears to remind us of the leaders before and the leaders within. His vision, justice-centered, people-powered, institutions inspected, remodeled, refined, with the sculptor's hand leaving the imprints of his care. Thunderously felt with whimsical replies and life-changing introductions, not just adding chairs, but building new tables, accepting no fables of who ought to be respected and revered, celebrated and elevated. And yes, historians, the keepers of the past, will speak of his mighty works. What I'll remember is the man who walked with us, his presence more than generous, his movement, living art.
Thank you so much, Dr. Joy. Thank you, Florian. And thank you so much to the audience for being here and listening and offering and participating in the conversation.